And as you can see, we are going to talk about Nehemiah this morning. And this falls in kind of the time frame in the Bible where I don't think the church studies a lot. I know I went through teaching a class one time, and I just did the entire timeline of the Bible, and I learned a lot. I mean, I had a Bible degree, and I learned a lot. Because it's just not really a time that we look at a lot, but it's something that I think we should look at more. And I will start off talking why we're going to talk about this. History is something, a lot of people do not like to study history. Personally, I've always enjoyed studying history, but a lot of people think, why are we learning about dead people, or why are we learning about something that's already happened? And there's a very good reason why we should study history. If you've ever taught it, you've probably been asked this, and you probably were able to give this answer. We study history so we don't repeat our mistakes. I was actually watching a video just last night about the amount of documentaries and movies and things that we make about World War II and about Hitler, and how much people compare people to Hitler and talk about, this is just like this, and the conversation was, is it a good thing or a bad thing? And I think it's taken too much, but in the grand scheme of things, we look at things like that so we don't let it happen again. So why do we study history? So we don't repeat those mistakes. And not only that, so that we can, that we copy our successes. So we see the good things that we've done, and we want to redo those, we want to do those again. So we study history so that we don't repeat our mistakes, and so that we can copy our successes. And I make about 3 or 4 of these slideshows a week, so sometimes I forget what I put into them, but this is a little cartoon. Those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it, yet those who do study history are doomed to stand by helplessly while everyone else repeats it. Nobody laughed. I guess I shouldn't have put that in there, but I found that pretty humorous. But we study history so we don't repeat our mistakes. And we learn from other people's mistakes so we don't have to learn from our own. So much of the time you hear people say things like, it's just a mistake I had to make, or I want to learn from my own mistakes. And I just want to strangle people when they say things like that, because you have people who made those same mistakes. Why do you have to make them? You can see someone else who made that mistake. You don't have to repeat it. So why do we study the Old Testament? Because I think a lot of people would ask the same question in the same way. Why do we study history? So why do we study the Old Testament? It's not the Testament that we live under. It's not the Testament that we govern ourselves by. So why do we study it? We see in Romans 15:4, whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we, through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. We study it because we can learn things from it. We can learn things because we can put ourselves in these stories. We can identify with characters. We can identify with things like Israel. If you watch Israel from the time that they leave Egypt to the end of the Old Testament, it's like they're just flip-flopping over and over again. They're going back and forth between being faithful to God and questioning God. And we can find ourselves in that a lot of times, where we have our high points and we have our low points. You see Abraham's lies, where he didn't have faith enough in God, when he lies about his wife being a sister, and you see the mistakes that he made, and you see yourself in those. And Moses' self-doubt. We just got back from Lads to Leaders, where the theme was I am, and it was about this section of Scripture where God comes to Moses and tells him that he's going to lead these people, and Moses just has all these excuses. I don't think I ought to do that. I'm not good enough. And we see his self-doubt, and we see our self-doubt, and we can find the comparisons there. And then we find stories that we should identify with. Moses leading his people. So even with that self-doubt, he went ahead and led his people, because that's what God told him to do. We see where Noah withstands the criticism, even though people were mocking him because they'd never seen rain, but God told him to build the ark, so he built the ark anyways. And we see that, and that's kind of inspirational to us. And we see that regardless of what people say, we need to stand strong in our faith. And then finally, we see where Nehemiah rebuilds the wall. And that's what I want to talk about this morning. We study this because there are things that we can find in this story that I think are very applicable to us today, very easily applied to the church today. But to get into that, I first want to give a summary, because like I said, this is one of those sections of Scripture that we don't study quite as much as we should. We don't look into it and know the story backwards and forwards the way that we should. So to start off, the nation of Judah is under captivity. It had been taken under captivity and kind of switched hands several times, but at this point, they are not all back into Jerusalem at this point. So you kind of have waves through Ezra and Nehemiah that go back into Jerusalem, but at this point, they're not all back. And here you go. Again, I make several of these, so I forget some of the things I put up here. But Ezra and Nehemiah are about the return to Jerusalem and the return to normalcy for these Jews who lived in Jerusalem. So in chapter 1, you see where men of Judah came to Nehemiah, and they told him that in verse 3, the survivors who were left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. So he's not living in Jerusalem at this time, but people come to him and tell him the state of Jerusalem, the state of the walls, and how sad it is. So you see, he mourned greatly and prayed that he could return and help rebuild the wall. It distressed him. I know not all of you are from Ripley originally. I'm not. I'm from Fulton, but if I heard that Fulton was just in all kind of disrepair and was in a terrible state, it would upset me just a little bit, because I like my hometown. So if you are from here, wherever you're from, you might can put yourself in that situation and think that, and then multiply it by 10 because of how important Jerusalem was to Jews, to the Jewish faith. So he was all kind of torn up about this. You go into chapter 2, and you find that Nehemiah is the king's cupbearer. So he was around the king a good bit, and when the king saw that Nehemiah was depressed and in a depressed state, he questioned him and asked him, what's going on? Why are you upset? What's going on with you? And his response is, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies in waste, and its gates are burned with fire?" So he's really honest with him. The king asked him, "Why are you upset? What's wrong with you?" And he says, "My hometown, where I came from, it's in pretty bad shape." So King Artaxerxes then allows him to return to Jerusalem. And this guy comes up a lot. This king comes up a lot in this area, and he allows a lot of people to go back to Jerusalem. And he comes across as a pretty good guy in the Bible. What he did in the secular world, I'm not entirely sure, but here you see a lot of times he allows people to go back to Jerusalem. And Nehemiah returns and inspects the remains of the walls. And of course, it's just like they said. It was in disrepair, it was torn down, it was in shambles. But you go on into chapter 3, and construction starts. And it's basically just a list of who repaired what portion of the wall. And sections like this, I think, are one of the reasons why we don't study this the way that we should. Because, let's just all be honest about it, it can get a little bit boring. Because unless you do really heavy research, you don't know what portions of the wall they're talking about. You certainly don't know these people that they're talking about. So it becomes kind of tedious to read all of this, and you kind of wonder why. Why did the author choose to put this in? And you have to think, this wasn't originally written for us today. This was written to record the history for the people of that time, so that their ancestors, the people a couple generations down the road, could look at this and know, and they still live there. They could say, that's the portion of the wall that it's talking about there, and I know so-and-so's grandson that did that. So it's not for us today specifically, but still there are things that we can look into all of this and learn, and we're going to get into that. But finally, in chapter 4, enemies of Jerusalem hear of the wall being rebuilt, and this makes them very angry. It makes them upset. So you see in verse 17 of the 4th chapter, those who built on the wall and those who carried burdens loaded themselves so that with one hand they worked at construction, and with the other they held a weapon. So that is a very simplistic summary of chapters 1 through 4 of Nehemiah. It's a little bit more complex when you start looking into the exacts of it, and of course you can go on, but we're going to cut off there. The wall ends up being finished in chapter 6, but for our purposes today, that'll get us to the point that we need, and hopefully I have done an adequate job of explaining it to you where you understand kind of the situation that we are in. But there are applications that we can see throughout this. And some of you might have, probably most of you have seen the movie Facing the Giants. And this is actually a story that comes up in this when he's talking about the defense, and says every man built in front of their own house. If you take care of what's in front of you, then this defense is going to be pretty good. Of course, it's a little bit more eloquent when he says it, but that's kind of where this is coming from. But there's a lot more that we can read into it. First, you read Nehemiah 3:4. And again, this is the section where it kind of seems like it just drones on and on about so-and-so did this and so-and-so did that, and you don't know what they're talking about. You don't know who they're talking about. But what you see here is, and next to them, and next to them, and next to them. And what you see in that is that every man, every person on this list had their job. So you take care of this section, and then the next person is going to take care of this section, and the next person is going to take care of this section, and on and on and on, and you have the entire wall taken care of. Every man had his job, and they did their job. Not somebody else's. They did their job. You see, it's so often that those who don't have a job hinder the work of others. And I can tell you this, working on a different schedule as my wife, if she's off during the day, she works at nights. When she's off during the day, I'll be at the office trying to get something done, and she'll call me, "Hey, what about this?" It's like, "Megan, I'm working right now." And the exact opposite for her. I'm sitting at the house like, "Hey, where is this in the house? I'm trying to save somebody's life. Leave me alone." So it seems to be that the people who do not have a job hinder the work of others. And if you've done much in the church, you see that it's the people who really don't have their own job that look at yours and say, "You're not doing that right." And that's a really sad feeling, to think, "Okay, come help me." But no, I don't really want to do that. And it's the people who are actually doing things that get the criticism. I've heard it said, if you don't want to be criticized, if you don't want to have people dislike you, if you don't want to have people talking about you, don't do anything. Don't do anything to try to help anybody, because that's how you get those things. That's how you get talked about. That's how you get people looking at you and thinking you're doing something wrong, is because you're trying to do something right. And it's so often those people who don't have a job. But in this situation, we see where these men have their job and they did their job. They were too busy doing their job to hinder or harass anyone else who was doing their job. So every man had their job. Do you have a job in the church? Do you have a responsibility? And if you don't, are you looking at other people and telling them where they're doing something wrong? You shouldn't be. You should be looking for a way to help them, to work with them. Every man has a job, and every man does their job. You continue on in this chapter, excuse me, in the 10th verse. You see where this man made repairs in front of his house. I'm not going to pronounce any of these names. I'm sorry. I don't want to embarrass myself. But you see where this man built in front of his own house. How much harder do you think he worked because it was in front of his house? He felt a personal responsibility because it was in front of his house. Think about the fact, if they break through the wall right where his house is going to be the first one destroyed. So how much harder do you think he worked saying, I'm not just protecting everybody, I'm specifically protecting my house, where my family is. So he felt so personally responsible for it. He worked a little bit harder to make sure that that wall was exactly what it needed to be in front of his house. So do you have a job, and do you feel responsible about that job at this congregation? Do you feel like you have a personal stake in making sure that your job is done the best possible way? You go on into the next chapter. So we built the wall we built, and the entire wall was joined together up to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. The people had a mind to work. They had a good work ethic. They were excited to work. They were ready to get this work done. So the question is, why? Why did they have a mind to work? Why were they such good workers in this situation? And I've got 3 reasons. There might be other ones, but these are 3 that I want to point out this morning. They had an unknown time limit. They knew that rebuilding this wall was going to make enemies, and it did. They did not know when these enemies were going to attack. They did not know if these enemies were going to attack, but they had an unknown time limit. So if you've ever been doing something and you know you're on the clock, but you don't know when that clock is, you're probably scrambling like crazy to try to get it done in the right amount of time. They didn't know when these people were coming. So they had the mind to work, because they had to protect themselves. They had a personal stake in the work. You know, if the wall was not up to snuff, if the wall was not what it was supposed to be, it would be very easy for the enemy to break through that wall. And that's their city. That's their homes. That's their life. It's like the last man that we were talking about who built in front of his house. You know, that's his personal stake, is his house. But if they all didn't do it, then it wasn't just their house. It wasn't just one person's house. It wasn't just that section of the wall. It was everyone. It was the entire city. So they had a personal stake in their work. And they had a sense of community. You have to imagine in situations like this, they've been through something terrible. You see people who go through hardships together, especially people who go through war together, and you see how closely they are bonded. And these people have gone through captivity together. And now they are back here, and they have this sense of community about each other. And not only do they want to protect themselves, they're looking at their neighbors and saying, I want to make sure they're safe too. I want to work hard because I care about them also. You know, this is not just work for me, this is work for us, for the community. And when it comes down to it, we have an unknown time limit. We do not know when the Lord is coming back. We do not know when this world will end. We don't know our time limit. But we have a job to do within that time limit. We are told to go out and build God's kingdom, to get as many people to heaven as we can. So, are we working with urgency? You have to think, they don't know when the enemy is coming. They had a great deal of urgency about themselves. They had a mind to work. Do we have a mind to work? Because we realize we don't know when the end is coming. We don't know how many people we can help in that time frame. We have to work with a sense of urgency. Do we have a personal stake in the work, like we were just talking about? Do you feel personally responsible for the work that you do? And do you have a sense of community? When me and Megan came and tried out here, I think I can say this because we're getting the parking lot worked on, but the parking lot was the first thing that we noticed. We saw some gravel patches, and we thought, okay, well, wonder how this congregation is going to be. And then we walked in, and we felt the sense of community. And we felt the love that y'all have for each other. And we left saying, I want to work there. I don't care about the parking lot. And it was just such a good feeling. And it makes me want to work so much harder. And I tell you, when I get to come here and meet with all of you, and such an encouraging congregation, and I'm not good at taking encouragement, so if I brush it off, I apologize, I'm not good at taking it. But it's such an encouraging congregation. It makes me want to work so much harder. It makes me want to be so much more exact, so much more organized, so much more ready when I get up to speak or teach class or whenever we do anything, because I have this sense of community with you. Do you feel the same thing? So much of the time, you don't have this because you don't let yourself have this. For some reason, there can be a lot of them, people just don't want to have that connection that some people have. And I always talk about watching Disney movies, because if you watch Disney movies with any kind of emotion whatsoever, most of the time you're going to end up crying. I'm man enough to admit, Coco, I lost it a little bit in that movie, if you've ever seen it. Just a little bit, not a lot. But if I would have went into it with a stone heart and not had it, say, I'm not letting this movie affect me, this is all dumb, I wouldn't have. It would have meant nothing to me. And it's the same thing here. If you come here and say, yeah, I'm going to church because I'm supposed to, but I don't really want to be close to anybody here, I don't really want to feel that sense of community, and you go in with a hard heart, you're not going to feel it. You're not going to have that sense of community. So, are you working with urgency? Do you feel a personal responsibility for your job? And are you doing that job because you feel that sense of community? And then here you see in verse 16. So it was from that time on that half of my servants worked at constructions while the other half held spears, shields, and bows, and wore armor. And the leaders were behind the house of Judah. So you see here half and half. There was one job to do. Half of them were doing one thing and half of them were doing the other. And it's very similar to us. Excuse me, this thing, my ear must not be right. This thing keeps falling off. But it's the same thing for us. Half of us can do one job, half of us can do another job. There were multiple jobs to be done. Some were easier. I would say those who were standing on guard when there was nobody coming, if they're just standing on guard looking at nothing, waiting on nothing to come, that's probably a little bit more easy. It's probably a little bit simpler. And then there were those who were working, doing hard work, trying to build this wall. Some jobs were easier. Some jobs were more glorious. Some jobs, you look at this situation, you see where some of them were going to be able to look back and say, you see that section of wall? I built that. Your granddad built that. Somebody built that. And they were going to be able to, have that glory from that, even if it's just like a quiet pride. I got to do that. While others were able to say, yeah, I stood watch. It wasn't as glorious, but they all had to be done. Somebody had to stand watch. Somebody had to build the wall. Somebody has to clean the building. Somebody has to man the sound room. Somebody has to prepare the communion every Sunday. There are small jobs, there are big jobs. There are jobs where they are very easy, but they still have to be done. There are jobs that are very glorious, but they're pretty hard. And people look at me and Josh like, yeah, they get to stand up and preach. That must be a glorious job. We do some small stuff too. We do some small, annoying stuff that it's not glorious. And I'm not complaining. I'm happy to do it. But everyone has their job. No matter how small, no matter how big, no matter how glorious, no matter how humiliating, everyone has that job and it has to be done. And with any team, any organization, if the pieces are not moving together, if it's like a machine, if the cogs aren't rolling together, there's going to be some problems. There's going to be some hiccups. And it's the same thing with the church. If we have somebody that's in charge of doing something as simple as making sure the bills get paid for electricity, and then we get to church on Sunday and that fell through the cracks. We don't have lights. We don't have a mic. We don't have, I'm shouting up here. It seems like such a small thing, but if these cogs aren't working together, then the church is not going to run as efficiently as it should. So they seem like small jobs, but if they're not done, there are big consequences. I talked about the communion. I have actually been to a service before where nobody did that. And granted, the people handled it very well. We sang a couple songs while somebody else took it in the back and made it. But there was that hiccup. There was that took people out of what they were doing, and they were not able to worship in the same mindset. They're very small jobs, but they have to be done. And this next point, I think, might be one of the most important that we can see. Those who built on the wall and those who carried burdens loaded themselves so that with one hand they worked at construction and with the other they held a weapon. So they faced adversity here. They were worried that somebody would come at any moment. So with one hand, I don't know how it actually would have looked, but I can just imagine one of them hammering on something and holding a sword in the other hand. Or maybe their weapon was a hammer and they were able to hammer. That's not funny, I'm sorry. But you can just imagine how much adversity they faced, that they not only had to do their jobs, but they had to fend off people who were wanting to hurt them, or at least be prepared for that. They faced adversity, but they still did their job. Nothing was going to come between them and completing their job. So if you have that job, what comes between you and completing it? And I know a lot of people have very difficult jobs. My job is here. And I know it's easy to look at me and say, yeah, it's easy for you to say that. Your job is to work here. Yeah, that's true. My existence doesn't change yours. Just because it's easy for me does not mean that that gives you a reason to slack off. And that's probably a bad way. I'm probably not the person to be able to say that, but that doesn't make it not true. Do you let your job get in the way of you doing your job here? Do you let your career, your secular job, get in the way of what you do here? And I understand because, like I said, my wife works nights. She works 4 nights a week now. She has to work overtime, 12 hours. I'm amazed that she gets anything done. She does. But I understand it can be, not everybody has a cushy job like me. It can be very difficult. These people put together a wall while they were trying to defend themselves. There are people with a lot worse circumstance than us, and they still do their jobs. Is that something that you can say? Is that something that you can look at and say, absolutely, I do my job regardless of what comes up in my life? Or are you the kind of guy, something come up? One of the things that I haven't said it that much here recently, one of the things I tell the teens a lot is don't be that guy. Don't be that girl. That doesn't really need an explanation. You've probably heard, they're that guy. And in this situation, don't be the something came up guy. Yeah, I was going to do it, but something came up and this kept me from doing it. Every once in a while, that's going to happen to everybody. Life is busy. Things are going to get in the way. But if that is something that you say consistently, there's a problem. If you are the kind of person that people say, can you get this done? You say, yeah, I'll get it done. And they turn around and say, hey, can you make sure that gets done? There is a problem. Do you do your job no matter what comes up, no matter what difficulties you face? So with all of this, you find your job. Don't try to do somebody else's. Find your job. Find a personal responsibility in that job to where you feel like you have to do this job. And then do it no matter what comes up. And do your job, not someone else's. Make yourself feel responsible for it. Have a mind to work. Have a good work ethic. There are plenty of jobs, and then get that job done. And the whole point of this lesson is not to call anybody out. The point of this lesson is this. And it kind of say, I'm going to bring it back around, but this is the point of this lesson. Get involved. There are a lot of people today that, man, I want to be a better Christian. I want to have a better relationship with God, but I just don't know how. This is how. Get involved. If you don't have a job here, I guarantee you the elders can find something for you to do. Maybe there isn't a program that will specifically fit your talents, but guess what? There can be. We can make one. We can find you a job. That is how you feel involved. And the reason that I know this is making music. Some of you have heard of it, some of you maybe not. We tried to get a trip going this year. I got it started just a little bit late. We're going next year because I love making music. I probably do not seem like the kind of guy that would love making music. Because what it is, you dress up in ridiculous poly-satin outfits, you sing songs and tell a story through the song, and you have to smile like this the whole time, or your directors yell at you, and it is not what I would consider fun, but I do love it. And I'm probably not the kind of guy you would think that loves musicals, but I probably know more about musicals than 95% of the people in this room. But I do love making music. Hated it when I started. Thought it was the most ridiculous thing. Why do people care about this competition where you dress up like morons and dance around and sing? I'll tell you why. Because the weekend before we started it, we had been working on it up to this point, but the weekend before we started it, we got out of school at 5, we went to a gym, and we practiced until midnight. The next day, started at 9 o'clock, we got out for lunch, and we practiced till midnight. Sunday, went to church, practiced, went to church again, practiced till midnight. We worked really hard for it. After that, I didn't feel dumb for being excited about making music. I didn't feel dumb for feeling committed to it because I had put so much work and effort into it. If you put work and effort into anything that you do, you're going to care about it. I mean, maybe you're not a sports person, but you see these athletes who are just so distraught after their season ends, and you think, well, why? It's just a game. How much work did they put into that? How much time did they spend in the gym practicing? They felt personally responsible for how that game turned out because they got involved. Do you want to feel connected to your church? Do you want to feel like you have a better relationship with God? Get involved. Because if you feel like you have a personal responsibility to this place, to this group of people, it'll come. I'm not the most emotional person in the world, so it's very hard for me to look at Christianity as an emotion. I think so many people try to. They want this emotional high, they want this spiritual high, they want to get excited, and that's what Christianity is. But, emotions go away. They're fading. You can't just depend on that. You have to have, your own personal responsibility. And that's something I've talked about before. And the way to do that is to find a job and get involved. And then regardless of what comes, do that job. So this morning, if you feel separated from the people that are sitting around you, and you want to get to know them, do a job with them. If you feel like you are separated from God and you don't know how to grow closer to Him, do a job for Him. If you feel like you have a job and you haven't been doing it up to the best of your ability, it's real easy to fix that. Change it. And I know a lot of the things that I said could sound kind of blunt. That doesn't make them less true. So we offer this invitation for anyone who wants to ask forgiveness for not doing their job, for anyone that wants to ask for help in doing a better job, or anyone that wants to make the best decision of their life and have their sins washed away. We offer this invitation now. Come as we stand and sing.